Please welcome back Mona Nicoară and the editor Erin Casper. And go ahead and take a seat while we wait for the other chair that we've asked for several times.
Well, at least we have 3 mics.
Yes. Actually, let me begin just by asking a little bit about how you got onto this subject and decided to make a film about it.
Well, I have another life as a human rights activist, which economically is always a bad decision, being an independent filmmaker and human rights activist. And I've been working, right after 1989, I started to work on minorities in Romania, but elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And it became clear towards the end of the 90s that segregation of Roma kids was a systemic problem. And as activists, all we could do is to say that this is bad, which is useful in and of itself, but it's a little harder to figure out what needs to be done. And I gradually got interested first as a research project to actually look at what things look like on the ground and what segregation and what integration actually means for the kids themselves and how one could do integration. So in 2005, I heard that there was a bunch of money that was coming in for integration in Romania, and I asked the Romanian Ministry of Education to tell me which are those locations that are going to do integration, and we started out scouting for the place that had the highest chance of success. And that turned out to be Târgu Lăpuș. Little did we know.
Right, you actually wanted to make a film about a success story.
Yes, exactly.
That's the thing that we always have to tell people.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a hopeful film, but this is what we ended up with after 4 years of shooting.
Well, and I think one of the really remarkable things about the film is how open everybody seems to talking to you. Not just the kids and their parents, but also the teachers and the local authorities, some of whom seem completely oblivious to how they're coming across in the film. When you got there, was it relatively easy to convince people to participate, or did you encounter some challenges on either side of that?
No, it was actually very, very easy. It's a very welcoming place. It's a small community that is very happy for the attention. It also helped that out of 3 people, we were a very small crew, the core of which was 3 people, and 2 of us had really strong Transylvanian accents. So people connected with us right away on that front, and we were able to understand the place on its own terms very, very quickly. But it really, in every place that we went, it took about 5 minutes of explaining exactly what we're trying to do before we could actually start shooting.
And Mihai mentioned when he was introducing the film that this is kind of a Romanian film and not a Romanian film because there was no Romanian money in it. Did you attempt to find any Romanian co-producer, and was there a resistance because of the nature of the project for Romanian production to come aboard?
Well, we started out, actually, we went in early 2006, we first went to the Romanian television, which was led by Tudor Giurgiu, who is running the Transylvania International Film Festival now. He was the head of the Romanian television then, and I explained the project. He knew some of the work that I had done before, and he said, absolutely, the Romanian, this is a public television project, we should do a co-production. Before we got to actually finish negotiating the contract, the leadership changed at the Romanian television, and we've tried to work with each chair of the Romanian television over the past 5 years. But the project sort of gets stuck at various levels of decision making. Some of the issues that came up were delightful. We were told by the, we were once told by the accounting department that this is a very expensive project. Why are we shooting for so long? Because Târgu Lăpuș is a small town. That, that got us a no a few years ago. And you know, it goes on, but it's not for lack of trying that we didn't get Romanian money. Yeah.
And actually, for both of you, can you talk a little bit about the editing process and which is so important in documentaries, and sort of finding the structure of the film in what I'm sure was a lot more footage that you actually shot than what we end up seeing?
Oh man. We edited for about a year and a half, and we ended up with about 80 hours of material, which is completely sane by today's standards for documentary filmmaking. And why did it take a year and a half? Well, for quite a while we didn't have an ending, actually. We thought we did, and then somewhere in the fall of 2009, I think, Mona started talking about with her co-director, Miruna, about going back and shooting a follow-up. But, and you guys did that in the summer of 2010, and that's when you found out that the kids had been put in the special school, and which was a really sad revelation for all of us, but it also meant that we had an ending. So, but yeah, for a long time, the film was basically just, and it still is, mainly the first school year that you guys shot, which I think is what you intended to do, was to follow them for just one school year. Structure-wise, man, it was, I think structure-wise, we kind of stuck to the chronology. We had to, because, kids growing up, yeah. And, you would know when something's really out of place, by somebody having facial hair or something, when they shouldn't. But I think overall, shaping the emotional structure took the longest, for sure. And for a long time, it didn't even have music in it or anything. So when that started to happen, that was like seeing the film all over again. So.
And I'm going to turn it over in a second to the audience, but before I do, I was hoping you could actually talk a little bit about the premiere at the Transylvania International Film Festival and what the reaction of the Romanian audience, the Transylvanian audience, was to the film.
Oh, we were absolutely terrified. Erin came for that. We first went to Târgu Lăpuș and showed the film to all of the participants. In the film on a small screen, so that they can get used to seeing their own story in film form in 90 minutes. When we arrived at the festival, we realized that Mihai and Tudor had placed us in the largest room available, the largest screening room available. And I kept thinking, do these guys remember that this is a documentary? We were absolutely terrified that nobody was going to come on. That was the first thing that scared us, and the other thing that scared us was that people were going to come and reject the film and feel very offended by the film. The kids themselves came. Târgu Lăpuș is about an hour and a half away from Cluj. They had never been in a cinema before. So this was a fantastic experience for them, but we also felt extremely protective of them during the screening. We didn't know how people were going to react to them, and we were so nervous that by the time the film ended and we rounded up absolutely everybody to come on the stage, we had like 20 people because everybody came with families and friends, and we weren't going to pick only some of them to come and do the Q&A. By the time we rounded up everybody in the front and we got to start thinking about the Q&A, we turned to the room and we realized that there was a standing ovation going on, which was unheard of and completely unexpected for us. Completely. We knew that people were reacting very strongly to the film. Sometimes they were clapping, at lines, but we had no idea that it was going to go over so well. And Aline was like right next to me, and it turns around and goes like, "These are Romanians, right?" I think it was a tremendously validating experience for them, and people who were there came afterwards, hugged the kids, said that this was a transformative experience for them to actually look at individual stories, because very often we talk about Roma as abstractions, and we talk about Roma and Romanians in these like very broad terms, but it takes a while to, it takes something like an individual story and a kid that you connect to, a person that you connect to really understand what those abstractions mean on a very human level.
Questions from the audience? Yes, here?
Hi. I have two questions. One as a Romani parent and one as a Romani everything else. My question as a Romani parent of two kids who has calluses from scrubbing their clothes so hard that they will never go outside with a stain. I'm wondering about all the dirty clothes. I mean, a lot of us Roma are very obsessive about being clean, so I'm wondering, did the parents know that the kids were going to be in these shots? Was it that, I mean, I know a lot of it was when there was no water. I'm just curious, like, do they really go around dirty like that, and would they change?
Well, they live in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty sometimes with no electricity, no water, and yes, they are very often dirty. Also, they live in the countryside. Any kid, you put my kids in the countryside, it takes like 7 minutes for them to be covered in mud from head to toe.
I'm curious, you know, if they knew that they were going to be in the film.
Yes, they knew at all points, but there's only so much that you can do. The kids themselves very often went to school dirty, and they were turned away from the school because they were dirty. You have a right to an education no matter how clean or dirty you are. And I think that that's not actually a valid reason for them to be turned around, but it resulted in a lot of internalized racism. And somebody like Dana, for instance, made sure that she's always absolutely spotless when she went to school, even when she was around the house. But not everybody can do that, and definitely, Aline is the middle child of 9. How you wash 9 kids, God only knows when you have no water.
No, and I wanted to thank you. I mean, it's obviously a very, very revealing film, and sorry to take up time, but my second question was, did you talk to, and this isn't just a privileged, educated Roma, but just wondering, did you talk to educated Roma in the area? And part of the reason I ask is because I know, in all the countries of Europe, and certainly in Romania, there are different kinds of Romani subgroups. So I'm just wondering what their take and/or your take was on sort of what kind of group this is. I mean, what is the subgroup? What are they? Do they speak Romani? Where are they sort of in the hierarchy of integration? I noticed a lot of them had jobs, which was interesting.
I'll just repeat the question for anyone who couldn't hear. It's the question of whether Mona interviewed any educated Roma in the area, if there were any, and where the people that we see in the film sort of fall within the social strata of Roma in this region.
We did actually, initially we had some interviews with colleagues of mine who are activists and highly educated Roma, but it became very clear to us that would actually kill the story itself, as the story of these kids. That the heart of the film is actually the story of these children. Now, this particular community is a community that has been there for about at least 100 years. They are caramidari, they are bricklayers, brick builders and bricklayers. They're relatively traditional, although not as traditional as other subgroups that are there, which are the Hungarian-speaking, highly traditional Roma, was the long skirts and the white pants and the hats and all of that. But they are bilingual. They speak both Romanes and Romanian, and they speak both languages among themselves. They do try to keep mainstream jobs as much as possible, but they are forced to be a little bit less integrated than Roma in cities, because this is the village survives, this town survives basically on this stratification. They are pushed into segregation against their will, I believe.
Other questions yes, you, sir?
Yes, so I graduated high school in Bucharest in the early 2000s, and I saw something like this in real life. In my high school class, maybe 5 or so Roma students to affirmative action came and joined our class, and the same sort of thing happened. They dropped out one by one over the years. So I was thinking, what do you suppose a practical solution to this? Because the movie made it the film made it very clear that it's a very sticky problem, and throwing money at it doesn't help, and other things don't help. What do you think is something that could work?
The question is about what is a practical solution for this problem, since throwing money at it doesn't seem to be the answer.
Well, I think throwing money is an answer if you throw it the right way, you monitor it, and you actually use it for the right purposes. It's not just money, though. It's a very complicated situation that has to do with changing the environment of the school itself, actually, and also helping these kids integrate, because just throwing people together is not going to help. The kids are going to be rejected for one reason or another, either because they're not at the right level, or because they're darker, or because they have a different culture. They're going to be rejected unless the environment is welcoming on the one hand, and they do get the support that they need to integrate. The money, for instance, that was used on building this school could have very easily be used for a support teacher. And one support teacher would have made a tremendous difference for these kids, actually helping them in the classroom, helping them outside the classroom, helping them do homework. So money is part of the solution if it's thrown in the right way, and it's about changing the environment and the culture. We don't have a very welcoming education system for minorities in Romania, and particularly for Roma.
Yes, ma'am, there. It's a question about whether being there for so long, making the film, did Mona have the desire to intervene and to help in some way before the film was actually finished and the film was out there to try to help the position of these kids?
It's a very good question, and it's a very tricky situation to be witnessing what is going on in that town, and especially if you come from a background that is an activist background rather than just a journalistic or filmmaker background. So there was that temptation at various points, particularly when the kids were supposed to be moved back to the segregated school. And that's a moment when we actually felt that it's our duty not to just witness a human rights violation, but actually try to report it. And we did talk to the Ministry of Education, who had been supporting this film, and they've been very open with us. We told them that this is probably what was going to go down there. I don't know where it went from there. I don't know whether they actually did anything. In the meanwhile, however, the European Court of Human Rights decision came down that made it impossible for them to be moved back. It made it illegal, basically, for them to be moved back to the segregated school.
Yes, way in the back, yeah.
I know recently, like in the last couple of years, Roma people
question about the expulsion of Roma people from certain European countries, and how does that affect the film's argument that a welcoming society is helpful for this situation?
I don't, if I understand your question correctly, or your premise correctly, I don't believe that Western countries, Western European countries, are actually much more welcoming towards Roma. There's just as much racism against Roma in, even in places like Ireland, in France, certainly in Italy. It just takes very different forms. And I don't think that those countries are actually willing, let alone prepared, to integrate Roma at this point. Definitely not more than the Eastern European countries. And there's, yeah, I do believe that no one is properly prepared, and the European Union is actually trying now to develop strategies, European-wide strategies for Roma integration, because they realize that this needs to be tackled by absolutely everybody. It's not just the problem of the Eastern European countries, it's a problem that's everywhere. I mean, there's school segregation in France. There's cases of school segregation. Greece was actually taken to the European Court and successfully sued for segregating Roma. Italy has the same problem. There's cases of segregation in Denmark. Norway recently turned out that they decided to combat white flight in various schools by streaming minority kids into lower education classes, inferior education classes, and keeping the Norwegians to themselves. So I don't think Western countries actually have very much to offer on that front.
And you were saying to me before we came up here that when you showed the film in Tribeca, you had teachers from New York telling you that this kind of thing is happening in public schools even here.
Yes, I mean the parallels to the South and segregation in the South are obvious for people here. But what was not obvious to me, and was a major surprise, is to hear teachers come to our screenings and say, this is actually happening now. Minority kids or children from immigrant backgrounds are pushed into special ed programs because classrooms in very many public schools are not inclusive enough, and teachers don't know how to deal with them, so they just rather shove them to the side.
We have time for a couple more, I think. Yes, you, ma'am, there? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. A question about whether the mayor and the school principal had any awareness of how they were coming across in their interviews.
Do you want to tell him what the mayor said?
Well, the mayor actually watched the film, was sort of was one eye. Every time he would show up on screen, he would like drop everything. Drop his cell phone, just like watch himself very, very intently. And he was very pleased with the way he comes across.
He said we portrayed him authentically.
Yes, he felt he looked very, very authentic. And he said, look how popular I am. I'm very good in front of the camera. To this day, he has no awareness of how he comes across. I think the school director, we showed the film together to the school director, and I think he has much more awareness about things not.
Well, I think, on the other hand, though, I think he was a little freaked out about, it's just weird to see yourself on camera. And so I think that was part of what he was concentrating on. I think in context he had some awareness, but I thought for sure, like, he's a smart guy, I thought for sure, he was gonna see how he comes across and not want to be in the film. But toward the end, he was listening very intently to one of his final remarks about, that the kids will always be drawn back into tribal life. And so, he's listening to that and he goes, I stand by my remark, even then.
You, sir, yeah.
How willing are the Roma to integrate Romanian society?
A question, how willing are Roma to integrate into mainstream Romanian society?
In my experience, and I'm not just talking about my experience working on this film, but I've worked as an activist in Roma communities in Romania as well as in other places in Eastern Europe. Roma actually do want to integrate, and they do want the same, for a very simple reason. They want the same opportunities that all of the rest of us have. The problem is that they feel very often rejected by society, and that creates an adverse effect on them. And it's very hard once they experience an initial rejection to come back and say, no, you got to try harder. I mean, for these kids, they wanted so much to go to school, and they wanted so much to play with Romanians. But the kind of rejection that they experienced is so tough. I mean, I'm even talking now as a parent. Like, how do you expect a kid to get over that and try actually harder on his own without any support, and just go back and be kicked again and be kicked again and again? So I think it's a very complicated race dynamic that needs to be broken.
Unfortunately, we have to stop there, but I want to thank Mona and Erin very much for being here and letting us have this wonderful film in the festival.
Thank you. Thank you very much.